The differences are clear right from the beginning, right?
Yeah.
Like Osaka Castle looks new. It looks very, very bright. This looks like a fortress. In Europe, there's a very clear line between castles and palaces,
Yeah.
right? But in Japan, the line between castle and palace was blurred
Yeah.
in some ways. So Japanese castles are new.
What do you mean? What do you mean by that?
新しい Many of them are reconstructed. And why this is important is because
こんにちは、全人類と友達になる男、僕がミスターです。そして
これです。
です。バルンです。
this
今日もこの時間がやってまいりました。
What 時間 time to shut away?
アーロン先生に教えてもらおう。今日のテーマは
プリン。
日本の城の素晴らしさについて。
Castle age, huh?
castle age, yeah.
Castle on the hill.
Castles are pretty cool.
I like what you said. Yeah.
So castles, pretty sick.
Yeah.
I like
sick.
I like castles. I guess the theme for this video obviously is going to be castles, but I think what I want to focus on today is what do castles represent?
Royalty.
When you think of a castle, what really comes to mind? And how have our attitudes towards castles changed over time? And of course, we'll do a comparison between Japanese castles and I guess European castles. Thanks, Anna. And then when we think of Japanese castles, we always think of very beautiful manicured landscapes and how well they integrate with the surrounding area and
Curvature.
yeah. The way the roof tiles are laid and so on. But I think what would be interesting is why do we think about Japanese castles in this way,
なるほど。
right? Why are they shaped the way they are? And let's compare how Japanese castles look to how European castles look and what our attitudes toward European castles are and the history of those castles and why they are shaped the way they are.
今日そのアーロン先生の授業を受ければ、この歴史全然知らない私でも、
はいはい
まず海外のこの城と日本の城の違い、これ第一段階として勉強できます、
はい
その後日本の城の歴史というか流れっていうのを海外と比較して、これまた勉強することができますってこと。
そうですよ。その通りです。
すごい。
やったー。
すごいぞ。今日すごい動画になるぞこれは。
じゃあみんなお願いしますね。
それでは
Let's
find out!
1個目。
ババン。
Japanese castles are beautiful.
They are very beautiful. Yes. Yeah.
でもなんか西洋のヨーロッパの城もすごい綺麗なイメージある。
Okay, well, I think we'll get into the weeds of this a bit more later, but I think let's think about the word beautiful. What does that really mean to you guys, right? Because when I think of a Japanese castle, I think of it being aesthetically pleasing in a very traditional way, if you know what I mean. So you look at a European painting, like a painter from the Renaissance, a painting from the Renaissance or something like that.
Okay.
You know, the colors they use, the composition of the image, and the way they're painting techniques. It's obviously no one can deny that you look at this thing and it's very, very aesthetically pleasing. It's beautiful, right?
Yes.
In a very similar way, I think Japanese castles in their current state, as we see them today, are in the same way visually very, very pleasing. And I think this is a really, really stark difference because, Anna, you made a comment earlier before we started shooting that most castles that we see today in Europe are ruins of castles from the past, right? The castles aren't necessarily reconstructed to look very pleasing, I guess, visually pleasing.
Even when they are reconstructed, they are reconstructed in such a way that it still tells the story of all the wars that happened in the area that the castle was built.
Right, yeah. So I think that's a really big distinction. Yeah, Japanese castles are beautiful, right? So I think a good example is we live in Osaka, so Osaka Castle. Osaka Castle isn't just the castle. What else is there in Osaka Castle? Koen. Yeah. What else is there?
Sakuras.
Moat.
Moat. Yeah. Lots of green space, lots of trees.
Bailing.
Yeah. The
Kankokyaku.
Yeah, kankokyaku. Too many.
Too many kankokyaku.
But yeah, so it's not just the castle itself, but the surrounding landscape is also very, very manicured. And I use the word manicured deliberately because it's been very specifically designed to complement the castle itself, right?
Yes.
Think about that. Yes. What an interesting concept to do to a castle. A castle of all things, right? Because a castle, what was a castle used for? What were castles used for in its historical sense?
Royalty.
Fortress.
Sign of power.
Sign of power, right? But in its original sense, it was used for war.
Yeah.
そうね、敵が攻めてきた時に迎え撃つためにあるみたいなイメージあ
And
る。
also for like, defensive purposes and things like that, right? It's, when you think of castles, my first thought, you think of war, right? Right? You think of violence. You think of
Age of Empires.
Age of Empires. Yeah, nice. You think of units. Spamming
Correct.
units.
Spam samurai from
units,
your
yeah.
castle.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so I think this is really interesting that like, castles in their original form were places of absolute horror. And yet now, look how beautiful they look. Very strange, don't you think?
So we are beautifying horror places.
Yeah,
right?
well, I mean, we can get into why the Japanese castles have been beautified, I guess, over time. But I think a very obvious thing you can say is like, well, we don't live in the Middle Ages anymore, so obviously the castles don't need to be places of fear or whatever. But I mean, this castle could very easily have been turned into a military base,
Yeah.
Yeah, for
right?
sure.
For the Jietai, for
I
example.
have the high ground, Anakin.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
This very could have easily been turned into a Jietai military base, but it wasn't. Why? Right. We'll get into that later.
西洋の城についてもう本当に知識がないから、なんか例でどっかの城見れたりする。
Yeah, sure. Anna.
I think the most わかりやすい例と比較する with the Japanese castle would be the European castle called Canwy Castle in Wales.
Oh, yeah. Sure.
カンウィキャッスル。
Conwy Castle.
Conwy
yeah,
Castle.
yeah. Just looking at this, the differences are clear right from the
Yeah.
beginning, right?
Yeah.
Like Osaka Castle looks new. It looks very, very bright. The roof tiles are curved, is ever so slightly like this. It's very aesthetically pleasing. This looks like a fortress.
Yeah.
This looks like some place that a dungeon would exist in, right?
That's right.
This place looks like there still would be guards out front.
People get tortured in there.
Yeah,
for sure.
exactly. And like the stones are blackened from hundreds of years of whatever.
I can
of
easily
age.
make this in Minecraft too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This could appear in Dark Souls, basically.
That's right, yeah.
Say a Japanese castle like this. If you look from the top down like this, it's probably in most ways a square, right? And that just tears up like a pyramid in some way. And the roof tiles kind of fan out like so.
Osaka Castle, based on what we see, just the building, right? Isn't it the castle also including the whole the park area?
Yeah, so
Because I think they used to have a wall around it.
right, yeah. So like, I mean, we can get into this later,
okay.
but like castles, like in Europe too, castles in Japan were castle towns, right? So they would have this main keep, like you see in Osaka Castle. That was like the main, most impressive building where like all like the leaders and stuff lived, and then there would be a courtyard of some sort, like a ring that surrounds it, and that's where like the high nobility would live, and then there would be a wall. And then outside of that wall would be called like the outer ring. There's like a Japanese word for it. There's an outer ring where like the somewhat lower class people would live, and the temple district and the other districts and stuff would be placed there. And then there would be another ring around that.
And then the Titans attack.
Damn it! I was gonna go there. I was like, God damn it! I was like, oh, and that's called Ball Maria. God damn it!
立ってる時代はもちろん違うと思う、ね、こっちの方が古城だからコンウィの方が多分古いような気もするけど、まあそれにしてもちょっとコンセプトというか、日本の方がなんかきらびやかな感じは確かにするね。
Yeah. It's like, I mean, obviously you're going to find some similarities between Japanese castles and European castles. Like, for example, they both have walls. They both have towers. They both have moats. These things are consistent with both Japanese castles and European castles. But I think the attitude with which these castles were constructed, I think, is the main difference, right? Even back in hundreds of years ago, during Sengoku when a lot of these castles were built in Japan, there was an immediate effort to make them aesthetically pleasing to some degree, right? But in European castles, they were built using stone mostly, and they served a very practical, pragmatic purpose, right? They were mainly used for defense and warfare, and there were some administrative things that happened inside a castle in European castles, but there wasn't so much of an emphasis placed on beautifying it. It was just dong.
ちなみに今ちょっと調べてみたんだけど、日本の一番古いお城、犬山城って呼ばれるところが1537年頃に作られた城もそうだったんかなと思って見てみたら美しい。
Right?
Right.
そうね。うわ、桜とね、
Right.
綺麗にマッチしております。
Yeah, and I think like a big thing to emphasize is like how the castle is integrated with the environment, right? So having the sakura trees like cover the castle just so, and taking a picture just this way or whatever, like that had to have been deliberate in some way, right?
I'm sure it was, right?
Right. So I think castles in Japan served more than one purpose, and I think a really interesting feature about Japanese castles, like the roof tiles. Like, and if you look at a pagoda, what do the roofs look like?
The same.
Right? Like on a jinja too, like they have these like sloped roofs like this, right? But having features that you see in shrines, like holy sites, being placed on a structure that represents warfare is a pretty interesting concept.
日本の城は美しいでした。
はい。
Yay!
2. Japanese castles are new.
What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that?
Yeah,
Yeah,
new,
like-
yeah.
1537, you said it's the oldest one, right?
But what I think I want to emphasize with this point, Japanese castles are new, is that many of them are reconstructed. And they were previously destroyed, but they were reconstructed. And why this is important is because European castles, like you're saying, Anna, if they're still around, they're left to, not left to decay, but they're left in their
Original form.
Yeah, almost in an original
something-
form, right? A thing with European castles is that if they are reconstructed, they're reconstructed using traditional methods.
Right.
So like they use like the similar stonework or whatever to make the castles almost look like as if they were in the past, right? But castles that were reconstructed in Japan, they were reconstructed using steel and
To reinforce
concrete
them, right?
and to reinforce. I mean, you know, Japan has earthquakes, so you want to preserve these things, prevent these things from falling down or whatever, right? But they made a deliberate decision not to use traditional materials. Why? That's a really interesting point.
Because they got good civil engineers to actually make
Yeah, that's possible, yeah. But like, because Europe has lots of good civil engineers too, but why did they choose to not use steel and make them like modern buildings?
steel castle.
Right?
Oh.
Because if you look at Osaka Castle was reconstructed in the 30s. And then, like Osaka Castle, a lot of other castles that were reconstructed before the war, they were destroyed during US air raids, and then they were reconstructed after that. Right? But why is there such an emphasis on wanting to reconstruct these castles into brand new, pristine looking buildings? Right? Because castles, as we understand them, are old buildings from a different time. Right? And so why is there this like, not obsession, but why is there this desire to make these old buildings, bring back old concepts and turn them into new things? I think the reason is there's a desire to bring old things from Japan's past to reintroduce to, you know, the public today kind of thing, right? The point is, Japanese castles are new and many of them are reconstructed. And I don't think European castles are the same, is my point. Yeah.
I can't imagine a European steel castle. I feel like it would be so hot in there.
Right.
Oh my god.
Yeah, like, look at like Osaka Castle today. Inside is a museum.
Yeah.
And with an elevator.
That's right. There's an
まあ
elevator.
鉄筋コンクリートで作られてるもんね。
Right,
あれね
yeah.
Oh, yeah, an elevator inside of castle, it's something that's just, it kind of destroys it in a way.
Yeah, but,
Well, back in the day, there was someone doing this.
right. Are you at the top yet? The fact that like there's an elevator is built of steel and stuff like that, yet in a castle, it seems kind of like two opposite concepts,
なるほどね。
right? And so obviously, Japanese castles in the past were made using traditional materials, but many of them are destroyed. I think there's only a handful, like 6 to 12 castles that are remaining in their original form that are still around. And those aren't turned into museums, but other castles, they aren't reconstructed into their previous form, but they're reconstructed into things like Osaka Castle with an elevator.
Modernization.
Yeah,
of
it's
castle.
modernized. Yeah.
Right.
And so you could take the phrase Japanese castles are new very literally and say, okay, Japanese castles in the timeline of castle history is probably relatively new compared to things like you see in, I don't know, Syria or Turkey or somewhere elsewhere in Europe. Those castles are obviously very, very old, like from before 1000 AD, for example. Right? Basically, the point of this section is that Japanese castles are new. They're reconstructed using modern materials to make them look not like how they did in the past, but to look like modern structures, which I think is very not strange, but it's a different attitude towards castles
なるほど。
than North American
わか
people
り
would
まし
think.
た。
Yeah.
前向き。
Japanese castles are new.
New.
でした。
Yay!
次. Japanese castles are integrated with the landscape and in the Japanese mind.
Wait, what? What do you mean by
Okay, so when you think of Japanese castles, where often do you find them?
that? Main cities?
Main cities, ijo, right? That's it, yeah. They're mostly in cities,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
You often don't see a castle in the middle of nowhere in Japan. right?
人が住むんだからそうじゃない
But in Europe and in North America especially, castles, there obviously are castles within cities, for sure. I mean, that's no doubt about that. But in Canada and the United States, there is like old fur trading fortresses that were used, hundreds of years ago, that are in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, it's not really integrated into the city. It's not like here's Los Angeles Castle. It's not like that. You have to drive at least 4 or 5 hours to find this historical landmark to visit any big forts or buildings in the States.
There's an old fur trading fort that the Russians built in California called Fort Ross. And that's like in Bay Area-ish north, right? And that's also in the middle of nowhere. It's nowhere near any civilization, right? But it's still around. I mean, it was built for fur trading purposes, right? But I think when I say it's integrated with the Japanese mind, is that Japanese castles are so a part of the Japanese urban experience, urban lifestyle, that it's hard to separate it from like the everyday life of a Japanese person kind of thing, right? But in our experience, and probably in Europe as well, castles are like they're just kind of around. They're just kind of like whatever. They're not really noticed. They're not really taken care of in the same way that Japanese castles are.
Yeah, we don't have like a Fort Ross Eki. Right? You have like Osaka-jo Koen Eki, the show.
Yeah.
Like you have a place where you could stop right there and go see the castle and you have everybody just walking around, right? And you don't even need to have a tour to go to the Osaka Castle. You just go there and it's just a regular part of life. Maybe there's some matsuris going on. You buy something from the yatai. There's like a festival going on in Osaka-jo. It's like literally integrated into the city where everybody can enjoy it. And the castle is like in the background, right?
Yeah. In the castle in the west, you go by car or go on a hike to a castle.
Yeah.
なんでなんよね
Actually, I think this is actually a very, very interesting point though. As a population, you want to stay at a place where you can get a lot of resources and you can get, live your day very comfortably and, can just live at a place for quite a long time. Like for what you say, you build some of the fort like in the middle of nowhere, but it does mean that it's used to be populated area, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess so.
But then in Japan, most of the castle is like in the city. Why? Because it's it's where the populations are.
Yeah.
But it doesn't change so much since like 500 years ago.
I guess like population patterns, like settlement patterns haven't changed that much in Japan. Is kind of what you're saying, right? But I guess in North America and maybe Europe, like Europe is basically flat more or less, right? There are some mountains and stuff here and there, right? Aside from the Swiss Alps, there are some it's like mostly a big plain, but there is like arable land, like farmable land is very there's a lot of it, right? You're not confined to like this strip of land kind of thing,
Pretty much.
right? Yeah. And in North America too, you can basically go anywhere in any direction, and obviously there's mountains and stuff in the way, but if there's a mountain here, you just go this way a little bit more, and then you can set up a settlement there. Right?
Because we have the space too, right? I don't think Japan had that real estate in order to make a fort really far away from the general populace.
Right.
And it's also like castles they are either on like places that are hard to reach to like make a safe place for the rulers, or on the borders. And the borders in Europe changed a lot during history.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. The other thing that's cool is that compared to Japan, that took a lot of care into rebuilding these castles to make them look very nice and make sure their landscape matches the aesthetic of the castle and so on. You can go for a drive in Europe and on the side of the road, it's like, oh, there's a decaying castle just right there on the side of the highway. Yeah.
Just a randomly old castle.
Yeah, right. Yeah, like I was in the UK last winter. And on the bus, like from Heathrow Airport into London, and like on the side of the road, there was just like a decaying. I don't know if it was a castle, but it was like a decaying, what looked like to be a castle, right? And that seems to be pretty commonplace, and no one cares about it. Japanese castles are integrated with the landscape and our consciousness.
Yes.
So in this next section, I think what I want to talk about is to really dig in, really unpack the reason why Japanese castles are the way they are today. Why so many of them are reconstructions, So some of the questions let's discuss. This isn't me telling you. This should be a discussion, okay? So let's try to answer the following questions. Why did Japan reconstruct these castles? What was the point? Was it just for tourism? Was there a deeper desire to connect to Japan's past? What do these castles represent? Is kind of like the main thrust of this video. It's kind of what I want to discuss here. So to begin with, I guess a little historical context for you. little historical context. So obviously castles were originally used for war, and many of them were originally constructed during the Sengoku Jidai, right? Warring states period, blah. But under Tokugawa, after the country was unified, these castles, they didn't really serve much of a military purpose anymore, so they slowly shifted towards administrative centers. So if you, like Paul, what you were saying before, a lot of these castles, historic castles, there was a town surrounding them, right? And each castle was controlled by the local daimyo, right? The local lord, and he had control of the population who lived in the castle. Kind of
Like current governor of the city.
Yeah. I mean, the comparison would be like that, and his city hall would be the castle they lived in, and so it was mostly administrative purposes.
So I had to go there to get my Jumin Hyo back in the day?
Yeah. So if you want to tenyu toroke, you have to go to the
then you have to
daimyo.
repair.
He won't let you leave unless you submit the paperwork.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sakoku.
Yeah, sakoku. But when the Meiji era began, it was all about-
Modernization of Japan.
yeah, modernization, industrialization, militarization. Why? Because Japan saw the rest of the world industrializing and getting way ahead of them. They looked at China and they're like, man, China's getting carved up by European powers. We're not going to let that happen to us. What we're going to do, we're going to industrialize, we're going to modernize, we're going to take all the techniques from Europe and make it our own. But there's still many lingering elements of Japan's feudal past in the Japanese landscape. And what big structures from the medieval era were there?
Wait, are you getting
Castles.
Are you getting to a point that they reconstructed the castle so that they're not looked as dangerous anymore by the Western powers?
We'll get into this. Yeah.
Whoa.
So
Is it because they don't want to lose their original identity when they are trying to modernize?
yeah, I mean that's certainly part of it. Yeah, and I think that's really evident after the war, after the Second World War. But if you look at photos of Emperor Meiji, there's photos of him like in very, very traditional like imperial
Yes.
garb, right? Japanese imperial garb. There's also another picture of him in like European military suit.
Yeah.
What?
Right?
No way.
Yeah, and like that, and that's how he presented himself from that time forward. And so there is clearly a desire or some sort of Japanese officials want to present themselves as modern and European, and they can't do that when they have these old medieval Japanese castles still dotted around the landscape. So what do? They destroyed them.
Wait, they destroyed the castles themselves?
Yeah, they basically destroyed most of them, I guess, and there's still some lingering on. But
How am I
like,
going to get my number card?
you're fucked. dude.
You're going to stay here forever.
No, Sakoku Part 2!
So yeah, during the Meiji era, they destroyed a lot of these castles because it was a reminder of how, I don't know, backward Japan was at some time, right? Because Meiji was all about modernization, and so they didn't want these things around. But once the Taisho era started, and especially Showa and onward, maybe there was some sort of anxiety about Japanese people kind of losing touch with their original identity, right? Like you were saying, their roots, right? And a big thing that reminded Japanese people of their past is what they see around them, right? And by seeing a Japanese castle as a Japanese castle, not a European castle, not a Chinese castle, not a building that has European influences like we see in Nakanoshima, for example, in Osaka. The Japanese castles are Japanese through and through. There's no real other outside influence. I mean, that's debatable, but those things were constructed by Japanese people. And so I think from the 20th century onward, there was a desire for some people to reconstruct these buildings. Reconstruct. Not to read about them or to teach about them, but to make them physically available in the landscape, which I think is a really important distinction.
So, existence of castle. When you see a castle, you are Japanese!
Is that how you feel, Mr.
Yeah.
Fuji, when you see a castle? Do you feel more Japanese looking at a castle?
まあでも日本人の心的なところはある。
Right? Because if you Google search Japan landscape or something like that, you will see castle, sakura, temple.
Yeah.
Those are like the three things that come up, right?
確かに
Yeah.
ね。
But those things, you would imagine that they would be, very dento tiki or whatever, right? And they are. But these castles are like 50 years old, if you think about them, right? So like, why did we want to just construct these? So, good couple examples. Osaka Castle and Nagoya Castle. These two castles were reconstructed using modern materials, modern techniques in the 20th century. And not like 1901, we're talking like 1930 onward.
Whoa.
Right? And not just these two castles, but other castles were destroyed by US air raids, and those castles were reconstructed after the war. So we're talking at most like maybe 70 years ago, right? 70 years ago, these castles were reconstructed.
My bad.
Crazy. What a crazy concept. reconstruct a castle in its original to look like its original form, but it's only less than 100 years old. Wild.
Right,
Strange.
right. It's like, why would you want to spend money on some old destroyed building?
Yeah. So like, you know, for example, if you buy like a vintage piece of equipment, right? Say like, I really like cameras, right? If you buy a vintage film camera, you want the camera to be in its original state,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Obviously well taken care of, but you want to have it in its original form. But Japanese castles, they're reconstructed to maybe look like they're old, but they're really not. And yet people are not okay with that, but
they're like drawn to them, right?
They welcome it. They still see it as a really big part of their urban landscape. Here's a theory. I don't know whether this is true or not, but I have a sense. Japan lost the war in 45. I mean, depending on where, if you live in Okinawa, it lasted until 72, or until the 70s. But 1952 is when the San Francisco Treaty was signed. And so during that time, Japan went through a pretty big Americanization process, right? And I'm sure to the average Japanese person, they see this foreign power controlling your country. They wrote a constitution. They rewrote Japan's constitution and forced an American constitution onto its people, right?
Yeah.
How are you supposed to feel about your identity as a Japanese person if your entire country was blown up from American bombing raids? The castles that were once a big part of your everyday life are no longer there. In some way, I can imagine some people having some sort of anxiety about your reality as a Japanese person slowly being watered down by the encroaching influence of an American power.
Who am I?
Yeah, who am I?
本当のところは確か分かんない。でもそうかもっていう話よ、ね。
Right, right.
いや
Exactly.
でもあり得ると思ってて、その第二次世界大戦が終わって、今からこうまた復興していこうっていう気持ちの時に、やっぱりシンボルみたいなのが必要なんじゃないかなと思って
Right, of course. Yeah.
日本人これから頑張るんだって思わせてくれる城を建て直してみんなあそこに気持ちを寄せてやっていくっていうのはあり得るよね。
Yeah, of course.
まあ、それくらい日本人の心にずっとあるものではあるよね、城っていう存在が。
Right. So it's not just castles, right? You know, it's things like having the emperor still around. I mean, the U.S. occupation they deliberately kept the emperor around just as a symbolic gesture kind of thing. We're not totally going to destroy your country, but we're going to do it in other ways. But we're going to keep your emperor there just for, you know, a show of peace.
Reassurance,
I guess. I don't know.
We are
But-
here for peace.
Yeah, and so you know, a lot of people can scoff at symbolism and at symbolism. Like, it doesn't really matter because they're just symbols. They don't really do anything. But like psychologically, to a people, to a population, of course, it's going to have some sort of impact on how you live your life, how you conduct your life, how you live as a person of this country. If you're born and raised in Japan, you're going to feel Japanese, and if you see around you things starting to, you know, get watered down and starting to disappear, it's going to result in some sort of existential crisis in some way. I can imagine in some way. Yeah. So, final question. After talking about all this
なる
stuff,
ほどね。
can castles be beautiful?
おー。
What do you think?
なるほど。
And
what-
what,
Japanese castle?
そうそうそう。日本の城が
Yeah.
美しいのか、あ、キャッソルっていうのはどこのことを言ってる
Well, I think
Zentai.
well, I think that's the trick question, right? Because if you say Japanese castles, yes, Japanese castles can be beautiful, but are Japanese castles still in its fundamental definition? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
In its original definition. Because when I think of castle, I
Like,
think
what
of,
what's the definition of a castle,
Well, yeah, exactly.
right?
What does it mean to be a castle? What is a castle?
難しいな。
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. I mean, like, if you think about Dracula's castle, that's very menacing, right?
Yeah.
If you see Japanese castle, what kind of connotation does it have?
Exactly,
Because there's
yeah.
the word Japan
Right.
before it,
Right.
Obviously, you're going to associate things that are beautiful because it's a Japanese castle. But then, if you really dive into the history and what they originally stood for, then I would say, right, it just depends on how you look at it. If you look at it from the point of history, I would say that no, they should be a reminder of what it was like during the wars in Japan, right? It should be it should be blood like splattered everywhere, like near the castle, right? They were places of war. And if you look at it from that lens, then I would say that no, unless I'm Taro Okamoto, then I wouldn't say that's beautiful, right?
That's
Yeah.
one of the reasons they are made of stone. It's way easier to clean blood off stone
There you go. Yeah.
than
Than
off
wood.
Wood.
If you think about like the way these castles were designed, especially Japanese castles, the Japanese castles were designed maze-like to funnel enemies into dead-end corridors and stuff like that. And so when they all gathered into one spot, the people would shoot arrows and throw stones on them and smash them.
Oh my god, that's what I do in Age of Empires.
Yeah, there you go.
The castle in Nijo, the one in Kyoto, the structure that shows how they tackle the assassin problem, the ninja problem.
Yeah.
So they purposely make the floor sound so that if someone passes it, they will know.
Oh yeah.
Even if you're a ninja,
yeah.
you will know you're.
Yeah. Right.
Okay.
Still
Which
there.
is,
yeah.
which is crazy, right? Because like
yeah.
castles have such a bloody, horrible history.
That's right, yeah.
And yet we look at them with such awe, like they're a church or something like that.
Right.
In the same way that we approach like a shrine or a church, we still see them as like a very, very like positive thing, even though they're locations of absolute horror and bloodshed.
Right.
So again, can a castle be beautiful?
If I was a warlord, it would be beautiful because it would be a great place for me to shoot down my enemies.
And gather people into
And
a
gather
corner.
people into a
Yeah,
corner
yeah,
and
yeah.
shoot down, right? Because,
yeah,
you know,
yeah.
you can't scale curved roof shingles as opposed to, I don't know, a medieval castle where you can just throw up like a hook, you know, make it taut and like climb up, right? If I have a curved shingle, I can hide behind the shingle and then go to the place where they can't see me and then shoot my Yumi, right? You know?
That's the wisdom of the people back then.
Yeah.
Ah, okay. Then in that sense, I would think that is beautiful. Right now, you know, I am not a warlord. War is not part of my everyday schedule.
right.
And I would think that after learning their history, then, you know, I'm kind of at odds with whether or not I think it's beautiful from just a regular person who goes to Osaka-jo to enjoy the sakura, right?
Yeah,
Exactly. When you see the petals on the floor, is it actually bloodshed?
Oh my god.
Oh my God.
Maybe that's what it represents.
It's pink because you don't think it's blood, but maybe it actually is. That's the preservation of history nowadays. Now think about that next time you go there for spring.
In Europe, there's a very clear line between castles and palaces,
Yeah.
right? But in Japan, as far as I understand, I may be wrong on this, but from what I understand, lords and kings and stuff lived in the castles that are shaped like they are today. So the line between castle and palace was blurred
Yeah.
in some way. So I think in that way, they're just the way Japanese people's attitudes about castles from the very beginning are different than how the West understood castles, I think is the conclusion.
Maybe.
That's why they wanted to destroy them at first, right?
Yeah, yeah.
They wanted
Makes
to
sense, yeah.
change the perspective of the Japanese people.
Yeah.
But I think above all else, I'm glad that they're still here. Even though that they are just a memory of the bloodshed that happened in the past, I think that as long as people can look at it from a very neutral lens, then I think that we can enjoy the beauty that still exists about the castle. But then the history should also never be forgotten at the
There
same
you go.
time.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Well said. Well said.
Yeah.
はい、ということで今日は日本の城の素晴らしさについてアロン先生に教えていただきました。ありがとうございます。
ありがとうござい
ました
日本の城とは日本人なんじゃないかなと
おー
これ思いまして。
というのは
っていうのは西洋の城って今日話の中であったけど基本は石を使ってブババババババババって高くして強くする目的は敵を寄せつけないことだっていうことの目的を達成するために作られてる、で対して日本の城って自然との調和であり美しいデザインでみんなの心の、シンボルになるようなね天守閣とかそうじゃん、みんなが見てあれが大阪城あれが名古屋城とかっていう風にみんなの心に残るような和を持ってるなって思ったのよね、あとは庭園庭がついてるたりするじゃん、ぶっちゃけいらないじゃんなんていうね、
Right, yeah.
その守るためには、広いその場所ない方がいいじゃん。
We don't need the garden. It's
So,
just,
so, so.
it's just for the castle.
It's
Yeah.
like in Japan you have the garden that it stays in a wall with the castle. Meanwhile, I think about Dracula's castle. We also have a mori around it that is meant to hide the castle.
Yeah. Because like I said, castles were for military purposes, right? We don't need a garden. So I think that's why like the reconstruction is so cool, interesting, is because we're going to reconstruct the castle itself. We're also going to reconstruct the parks and the gardens around it to make it publicly accessible, to integrate the castle into the population. That's a really interesting idea. Like the attitude towards the castle as a public gathering space is, I think, totally contrary to what its original purpose was.
だからなんか城のことを海外と比べれば比べるほどなんか城って日本人っぽいなっていう感覚がありました。
Made by Japanese people, for Japanese people, by Japanese people.
In Japan,
in
yeah.
Japan.
ということで今日はアーロン先生に日本の城の素晴らしさについて話していただきました。で、皆さん 本当毎回なんですけど歴史の話深くなればなるほどやっぱり間違えることがどうしても出てくると思うんですけど、専門家じゃないんでね、アーロンは。で僕らも専門家じゃないから、もし間違えてたら優しくコメント欄で教えてください。はい、
Again, it's about interpretations. That's the main thing that we do with history.
他にね、歴史系の話でこんな話してほしいなっていうのがあればコメント欄までそちらもよろしくお願いします。あと皆さんの好きな城、コメント欄でそれも教えてくださいね。それでは次の動画でまたお会いしましょう。バイバイ。チャンネル
登録
お願い
します